Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar focusing on trauma. I'm Dr. Jocelyn Mackey, an education consultant with the Connecticut State Department of Education, and also a certified school psychologist, special education teacher, and intermediate administrator. I have also had the pleasure of teaching university students as an assistant professor of psychology and continue to do so as an adjunct professor. My interest in conducting this webinar is to explore the concept of trauma and its impact on student performance, as well as the significance culture has on how trauma is manifested and experienced among students of underrepresented groups. Additionally, we will consider information to inform best practices in engaging students and families of underrepresented communities. I am pleased to have four amazing panelists who bring a host of varied experiences and knowledge that will enrich this conversation. In alphabetical order, I will begin by introducing Nitza Diaz. Nitza is an education consultant with the State Education Resource Center and the Connecticut Parent Information and Resource Center. Nitza brings coaching, professional development, training, and technical assistance for educators, families, community organizations, and faith-based leaders. As a Latina Puerto Rican parent and educator, Nitza draws from her own experiences to help others understand how systemic racism, poverty, and inequities affect schools and communities. Nitza holds a master's in public health and a master's of arts from the University of Connecticut. She is also a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology at UConn. Eric Elias is a school psychologist who proudly serves the Meriden Public School System. Eric is entering his 32nd year of practice and has the distinction of being Connecticut's 2018 School Psychologist of the Year. In addition to his work in Meriden, Eric also co-hosts a bi-weekly podcast called School Psych, and he is an active member of the state and national level associations of school psychologists. Having had several articles published on behavioral supports, Eric continues to contribute to the field of school psychology and evidence-based practices. Dr. Jason Lang is Vice President of Mental Health Initiatives at the Child Health and Development Institute and a licensed clinical psychologist who holds appointments as Assistant Clinical Professor in Psychiatry at UConn Health and at Child Study Center in the Yale School of Medicine. Jason currently leads CHDI's behavioral health initiatives, which include such areas as evidence-based practices, trauma-informed care, school and community programs, and policy and system development. Jason has published and presented nationally and internationally on childhood trauma, evidence-based treatments, trauma screening, and implementation science. His work has encompassed child welfare, juvenile justice, behavioral health, law enforcement, education, pediatric primary care, and family advocacy. Amber Moy is a diversely talented educator with over 5 robust years of experience. With a bachelor's degree in strategic management from Howard University and a master's in education policy and sociology from Columbia University's Teachers College, she has dedicated her expertise to educating public school youth as a K-6 certified teacher. Amber has also written professional development, classroom curriculums, and policies to improve educational practices. Amber is a passionate proponent of racial justice in education, and as a board member of a social justice nonprofit charity, she takes an active role in rallying for racial equity and policy changes. Amber is also a founding member of a family racial equity committee at a local K-8 school. Please join me in welcoming our guests. So let's jump right into it. When we think of trauma, a host of images and thoughts come to mind. And certainly we are all prone to experiencing trauma, which knows no ethnic or socioeconomic boundaries. Yet we recognize that the types of trauma to which we are more likely to be exposed the availability of resources, and the degree to which such resources are accessed are influenced by cultural factors. So best practices in intervening with those experiencing trauma may vary from one group to another. So Jason, let's begin by first discussing what is meant by the term trauma and how might trauma impact the lives of youth?
Thanks, Jocelyn. So trauma is complex, and the different ways that people describe trauma and what trauma is can be confusing. One time it really referred to life-threatening or extremely frightening events or experiences, but trauma has become more commonly used now as a catch-all to describe events or experiences that are stressful, difficult, including life-threatening or extreme trauma, but including other experiences as well. And there's lots of other terms that are used, like adversity and adverse childhood experiences and traumatic stress and toxic stress. So I think an easy way to think about it is SAMHSA has a definition with the 3 E's, and those are exposure, experiences, and effects. And the exposure is really the events or experiences that children and students might be subject to. So abuse or violence or the death of a loved one, other adversities like living in a home with parents with mental illness or substance abuse issues, racism, discrimination, really any type of experience that can be stressful or difficult. The second E is the subjective experience, so how the child understands and makes meaning of the trauma within the context of their family and culture and community. And then the third E is the effects, so how does trauma affect the child? And the effects can really vary quite a bit. They can include traditional classic signs of trauma, which might consist of post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, things like re-experiencing the events that happened, having nightmares or flashbacks, not wanting to think about or talk about the trauma that they've experienced, which is called avoidance. And it could include negative thoughts about themselves or the world, blaming themselves for what happened, feeling a sense of shame, feeling the world is not safe. And then finally, it can include changes in their reactivity, so aggression or irritability, being hypervigilant to sense of threats or danger, problems sleeping, problems concentrating or paying attention. And then beyond those classic signs and symptoms, there are a range of other effects of trauma, including biological changes to our brain development and stress response, problems with other mental health conditions, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, difficulties with relationships, family, peer, other relationships, and that can extend to challenges in school, performing academically, attendance. And ultimately, there's a large body of research now, the ACE study and follow-up research that showed the effects on health outcomes in childhood, but also throughout adulthood.
So Jason, you mentioned the effects of trauma on individuals, and we know that not all forms of adversity are traumatic. What determines whether an adverse situation has a detrimental effect on a child?
Yeah, it's really a tough question because it's very difficult to predict how any given child will respond to any given type of adversity or trauma. There's tremendous variation in how kids respond, and one of the biggest factors is the child's, that second E, the subjective experience of what they went through, how they make meaning of it, how they understand it, how their family and culture and community understand whatever it was they went through, and how much support they have. The good news is that children are pretty resilient in general, and overall, about 4 to 5 kids who experience a trauma will recover without mental health support, without professional services, but with natural supports that they have at home and in the community. And it's also important, I think, to realize or to recognize that for any child who's experienced trauma, a brief period of distress or concerns after that exposure is very common and normal. Within the first few weeks, days, weeks of trauma exposure, we expect, that children might have some distress, and that doesn't mean they need mental health treatment right away. It's just a normal reaction to a abnormal event. So some of the things that will predict, to some extent, whether a kid will go on to continue to have difficulties and might need some additional support include the most important is the support of a caregiver or loved one. A child who has a parent, caregiver, even another adult extended family member, teacher, religious figure who can be there for that child, support them, talk them through it. That's the number one predictor of recovery. Some other ones include whether there's an ongoing danger. So children who experience a type of trauma where they're still at risk for continued exposure. So, for example, ongoing domestic violence or ongoing abuse. Those children are at much greater risk of ongoing problems. Of course, the nature and severity of the trauma, there's many different types of exposure, which we talked about. So some of the more severe life-threatening traumas and interpersonal traumas where they're perpetrated by somebody who is supposed to protect or care for that child, those put children at much greater risk. Some other things include the child's prior trauma history, any other mental health concerns, the family's prior trauma history and how they understand and address trauma, racism and discrimination that child may experience. A recent study that just came out showing actually that for children receiving trauma treatment, they actually don't do as well if they're living in a community with high level of racism and discrimination. And then last is the availability of coping strategies. So what resources does that child have? And these are some of the things that SEL programs really try to do, build in, inoculate kids for stressful or adverse experiences. And so hopefully they have some of those skills that they can draw on. But the bottom line is we really just don't know for any particular child unless we ask and understand what that child went through and how they and their family are thinking about and understanding the trauma and how it affects them.
Great. Thank you so much, Jason. Really valuable information. Eric, trauma is broadly experienced across communities, and Jason has really highlighted the fact that how trauma is experienced within certain communities certainly can vary depending on a number of variables. So we know that trauma may disproportionately impact students from marginalized communities, so people living in communities with a lower income, ethnic and racially underrepresented groups, LGBTQIA+ communities, individuals with disabilities, as well as women and girls. Could you share some of the reasons why you believe this is so?
Yes, Jocelyn. I think the terms marginalized and minoritized can be effective in helping understand some of this. I think of the term minoritized as opposed to minority because it implies that it's not an issue of number, where one group has more people and another group has fewer people, but it implies an imbalance of power and equity, and implies that one group or several groups might be dominant and others may be subordinate in some way. And so for many years, we have actually marginalized people in this country, and we've actively had policies and practices that marginalized numbers of people, groups of people, and communities. And I think what we see today with poverty and lack of resources is a reflection of the impact of these practices. And so we have communities that are undersupported in terms of having fewer resources for education, having fewer food sources, having fewer less access to healthy food choices and grocery stores, folks who have unreliable transportation, maybe impoverished folks are going to have less access to healthier groceries, or businesses move out of poorer communities, and so we have schools that are undersupported and a tax base that is less strong than it would be in a suburban community or a community where there's more wealth. And so what ends up happening is our students and our family members who live in these communities have access to fewer resources, and the schools are less supported as well. And I think just needing to be aware of it is the first thing, but we have to take actionable steps to move beyond this. And the trauma will continue, right? We have historical trauma, generational trauma through poverty and minoritization of people and marginalizing people. So I think just beginning to address it is the first step, but I think we have a long way to go with that.
So, Eric, let's take a look at some of the competencies necessary for student success. How might trauma disrupt the development of core cognitive, social, emotional, and behavioral competencies that are needed for students to succeed in school?
Sure. Jason mentioned the ACE study, Adverse Childhood Experiences, and I think, based on some of the research through the ACE study in the late 90s, and some of the work from people like Bruce Perry and Nadine Burke-Harris, Bessel van der Kolk, for example, on trauma and how it impacts human development and childhood development is pretty important. And we're beginning to see the impact of trauma and stress and continued stress on children. It impacts neurological development in young children, the myelination of neurons, the pruning of neurons, where we begin to learn certain things from motor skills to math and reading, those early childhood experiences that we'd have in school or preschool are impacted by our exposure to stress and trauma and lack of resources to cope and work through it. And so we're finding that kids who have experienced a lot of stress and a lot of trauma are often hypervigilant, and so they're in survival mode, what we might call fight, flight, or freeze kind of mode. So they're unable to relax and access the curriculum the way a child who hasn't experienced the trauma, or a child who is coping better or has the resources to cope. So what we've learned from some of these researchers is that it's not only impacting just how we might interact with one another, but the trauma can impact us from a neurological development, from the top down, to the way we think, the way we learn, the way we socialize, and get along with one another.
Great, thank you. Nitsa, given your expertise in family and community engagement, from your perspective, why is it important to not only understand the role of trauma in the lives of youth, but more specifically, its impact and expression within underrepresented communities?
So I'm going to follow along from Jason and Eric, right? And so if you remember, both of them talked about that experience that is very cultural to also think about, how do I think this is a traumatic experience? At the same time, if you think about historical trauma, right, at communities of color where throughout history they have been traumatized because of racism, because of language barriers, because of many, many things, this is what they're carrying to school. And even though a family or a parent may believe in that there's nothing wrong with going to that school because of their own history and experience with that school that could have been negative, they teach their children how to have those survival skills. And I think things like that are important to understand, and that also traumatic events, if they think about it by their nature, create a power structure. So if I've experienced historical trauma, if I've experienced racial trauma from my community has, and I'm part of that community, that power structure is over one entity to another entity. So if I come into a school and the only thing I see is a power structure that says, you know what, Nitsa, you're not good enough, or you don't know, this is not going to help any one of us. So our job, I want educators to remember that we need to be able to start from that positive perspective, from that belief that anyone who comes through the doors, we're going to welcome them, and that all of us have something to bring to the table, so that I can start trusting what I don't know about.
So great points, Nitsa, and let's expound on that a little bit. What are some of the factors that educators should consider when engaging families of students from underrepresented groups with regard to trauma?
So they should think about, I'm going to say, like self, others, self-reflection, and intentionality first. So that is one of the factors. And understand, how do I, as an educator, also define culture? Meaning, are my beliefs aligned to what someone else's beliefs are? We know that I'm going to teach and going to be doing any type of job based on how I was raised, which is my culture. So that's a big component. So one of the factors, like for me, is always the self. How do I self-reflect in what I know and what I believe families should be doing in my classroom, or if you're a teacher, or with something else? What are the collective norms that I have that the families do not have, that are different from me, not good or bad? And being very intentional, and sometimes it's hard because as humans, we don't like that. We just don't like feeling uncomfortable and saying, you know what, Anita, I think you messed up. Maybe you should try something else, or maybe you should get to know that student. We also know that the brain really thrives in that relationship building. That's another factor that I would like for them to remember, that understanding self to understand others is basically because it's part of that biology, for lack of a better word, that the brain thrives in that relationship building. And so that's really important. And that traumatic events, right, they don't also happen in a vacuum. And so a big factor is that trust. So how do I generate trust? How do I understand self, others, and to start building that trust? That trust generators. Well, I like that, trust generators. So that the child who's at the center can truly start feeling comfortable with both type of relationships, with the school and the families.
Great. So, Amber, let's look at this from the perspective of the educator now. Could you discuss some of the experiences that educators are having with recognizing and responding to student trauma?
So one of the things I would say is, on the plus side of this, I think it is great. And as educators, I would say that we're super excited to be able to have a lot more of this conversation being integrated into our professional development, into our planning, into our training. So it's been really helpful to get this language. I think the residual impact of that has been that we're starting to spend a lot of time doing things that are not within our locus of control, like trying to diagnose trauma, which then is causing us to be more reactive to the trauma. And I think where we may start to see a lot of the labor become is when we're able to be more reactive rather than responsive to it. So that is the plus, right? So like we're getting more of that. But I would say in terms of our ability to respond critically is exactly what Nitsa said. Creating space where students feel invited to be comfortable and valued pieces of the learning experience, and really valuing the knowledge that they bring in is going to be pivotal in that, particularly when folks are trying to educate across lines of difference, whether that is race, whether that is class. It's really important that students come in at every level, pre-K to 12, recognizing that students feeling valued in the learning space is the foundational groundwork to that. And it's really difficult to do that if we don't have some sort of lens to recognize what they may have experienced before coming into the school building. And so I just think of 2 weeks ago, I ran into a student that has a really difficult time in the mornings, and I saw him at 7:05 in the morning standing at the bus stop with his sibling. So I happened to see that student because of the route I take into work, right? And so when his first period teacher is frustrated with him because he's already restless, I was able to provide a level of grace for him, even though I wasn't his teacher, to recognize, wow, he's endured quite a bit before he even got here. So I think that that recognition is coming along the way, and that is because of the integration of social emotional learning into learning spaces. And I think it will in turn allow us to respond more proactively as we continue on to make this a really important piece of student learning. So we got a ways to go.
Thank you, Amber. And certainly we recognize that that the challenges for educators, for teachers, are vast. So how might educators take a glass half full approach that focuses on student strengths, enhances resilience, and supports a sense of belonging for students experiencing trauma, and more specifically, those from underrepresented groups?
Well, the first thing I think is critically important is self-awareness. And as Nisa said, not only recognizing our biases, but recognizing our strengths in terms of how we can use what we may have not experienced as an opportunity to create shared learning spaces for students where you may not always be the expert every single time. I think in the light of what COVID has, the residual impacts of COVID for us here and today is that students have been held responsible to be stronger leaders in their own learning. And so how do we now take things such as an experience like COVID, where students were at home learning for a great deal of time, or students were supporting their younger siblings while also trying to maintain their own academic progress? And how do we now take those skills and say, what can students do in terms of serving as facilitators in learning rather than having to be lectured to for the great deal of their day? So I think that that's one piece. But the other piece is, in terms of recognizing the cup as half full, is to allow students the opportunity to feel safe to express those experiences in ways students can serve as teachers to their teachers, right? And so how do we share experiences to show and demonstrate that while we can look at adverse experiences as negative all the time, but there are always benefits to those experiences, because later on in life and sometimes in the current, having those experiences allows students to be a little more experienced in terms of their ability to respond. And I think that that is going to be even more critical as students grow and learn. As they are matriculating, it's incredibly important for students to have the stamina to be resilient, the stamina to respond to adversity in school and out of school. So I think that that shared space and creating opportunities for students to continuously discuss things that are discomforting and allow teachers the opportunity to kind of integrate those into learning experiences for students is going to be incredibly huge.
Excellent. Thank you, Amber. Eric, we certainly recognize that in light of what we've experienced in the last year and a half, that the role of mental health specialists in schools is key to supporting student development and success in school. And in light of the pandemic, there has been an increased need for schools to provide mental health support, especially for schools serving predominantly students of underrepresented communities. Could you share some examples or ideas as to how mental health specialists might support students and educators regarding this need?
Sure. In education, we often speak about providing services across tiers. So we typically have a 3-tiered model that we provide services across. And so, for example, the tier 1 would be a universal expectation or a universal supports, where we are providing the same supports or expectations to everyone, starting at the classroom level. Tier 2 would be more targeted, and tier 3 might be more individualized. So how that might look for mental health supports may be providing support for the teachers in the classrooms to embed SEL, as Amber mentioned, social and emotional learning, those groups, morning meetings, and restorative practice time for classroom teachers to be able to do that in the classroom with everyone. And so beginning to use some language that's consistent. There are a number of programs that teachers can use if they don't have to create things themselves, a number of curricula, and using some of the same language, identifying affect and beginning to speak about coping tools and ways that we can uh, cope and get through some of these stressful times. And then more targeted, so being able to pull students into small groups if kids need at a tier 2 level. So maybe weekly or biweekly support in terms of some social skills groups or counseling groups or therapeutic intervention. And at a tier 3 level, more individualized. So some perhaps kids that need behavior support or doing some individual therapy or counseling with kids. And certainly underlying that is the resources, right? The teachers need to have support to be able to do that in the classroom and be given the freedom and time to be able to embed that into their curricula so that they're not pressured, more pressured with something else on their plate. And then having adequate mental health support in the schools, whether it's partnering with community agencies or having school social workers, school counselors, and school psychologists in the building to be available. And I think along with that, support for our teachers. There was an article recently in the Washington Post that was entitled something like "The Teachers Are Not Okay," and it was reflecting upon the fact that educators are stressed in this time period too. So really providing some sort of adequate support for our educators to feel supported, to find ways for the adults to cope as well. And I think Amber used the word grace, right? Providing grace for one another, not only for our students, but for each other.
Thank you, Eric. Amber, Eric has mentioned a number of ways that mental health specialists can support students in the school environment and more specifically provide support to educators. Could you possibly help us in operationalizing what that might look like for educators? So what are some of the ways that you have found educators to support students experiencing trauma with regard to multi-tiered systems and supports or various school-wide plans or classroom practices?
So from the school level, one of the things that we did immediately this year to sort of operationalize and integrate was that we literally integrated our social emotional learning committee with our equity committee. What we found is that there was a lot of work that was starting to overlap, and there were some things that went unaddressed on both ends. So as CASEL is shifting, we recognize, one, in terms of capacity, we don't physically have the capability to operate both committees effectively. So we brought those two together, and the integration of that has not only allowed us to create aligned goals for ourselves, it also allowed folks that thought that they were mostly passionate about equity recognize how much social emotional learning was also a piece of that, and vice versa. And so doing it operationally is the first piece. But I think one of the other things that is happening at the classroom level in terms of how those things are trickling down is creating systemic investment. So it's not that the kindergarten teacher values that because she's working on letter name, and that the 8th grade teacher is so inundated with Common Core standards that it is happening more in this place and not there. So once we sort of created a sense of, in terms of like a mantra or a mission and a value rather than a mandate and a requirement. These are the things that we believe as a school, and our school leader has really done an incredible job at reinforcing the idea of belief rather than a mandate. Like, here is what we believe to be true. And so sort of shifting that language for educators allowed us to be a little more accepting of the fact that integrating social emotional learning and taking time to invest in how we feel and how we respond was not time lost. Instead, it was actually the better use of time to allow us to respond to some of the more academic needs. So I would say, and then second to the classroom meeting time is incredibly huge. One of the other pieces that we've recognized in terms of creating the small groups that we've done to what we thought was meet the needs of academic instruction for this year to close the academic gap, students have built relationships with other folks in the building other than their teacher. And that has created the opportunity for them to feel community outside of their learning space. We've been able to meet the needs of students a lot quicker, whereas there may not be the strongest relationship with that person who's driving your academic instruction, but having opportunity to build relationships and positive relationships with other adults in the building, we've noticed has yielded a lot more effects in terms of responding to behaviors that could have otherwise been disruptive and distracting.
Thank you. So again, highlighting the fact that, we're asking a lot of educators and teachers, certainly. From your perspective as a teacher, what kinds of supports do you believe educators require to more effectively respond to the needs of students experiencing trauma? How can we support teachers?
I think one of the teacher supports is actually allowing us to be held accountable to demonstrate how we're doing that. Sort of a each one teach one kind of way. I think there's a lot of great things happening in schools, but if we had the opportunities to be reflective about the way that we are prioritizing social emotional learning, I think that would yield a significant impact. And so, as from speaking for myself, I don't know that I am as reflective about my social emotional learning practices as I am about my math practices or my ELA practices, because it is not held in the same way in terms of how I have to be reflective. So I think that one of those supports would be huge. But the other piece in terms of the physical, tangible professional development is that too has to be systemic. We can't do like the pop-up SEL training. We have to integrate that consistently and allow us to have time and space to be able to reflect on it, adjust, and move forward. And so I think that if we don't find ways to make that a consistent part of our professional development, in 3 years, when we think that the COVID effect is over, we'll start shifting into more standardized practices that will allow us to gradually forget how important these things are. So, yeah.
Thank you. Jason, we certainly recognize that in order to provide truly effective support for students in schools, we really need to embrace a collaborative, cohesive approach. So how might the school and the community join forces in support of students and families experiencing trauma?
Well, I think all of us have kind of touched on how trauma is such a huge and complex problem. It's a public health issue with many causes and strategies needed. There's no silver bullet to addressing it. It's also a common problem in that, more than half of kids have experienced trauma in the last year. Not all of those kids need supportive services, but some of them do. And those kids are all in our schools now. And, teachers and educators, they know that it's out there. But schools and educators that are learning about trauma and mental health sometimes think that it's an issue that they need to solve alone or to deal with alone within the building. And it really can't be solved that way because it is such a complex issue. And it needs to be a collaborative effort with community resources, as the other panelists have touched on already. But schools don't have to create a whole behavioral health system. We have that. We have other resources. We have other expertise in trauma that can be part of the solution and should be part of the solution. I think also there are sometimes just challenges with integrating services between schools and community providers. It requires creative thinking. There's funding implications, maybe liability implications. And some of that takes some time to work through. The federal funding right now through COVID relief funds presents, I think, a real great opportunity to help schools jumpstart this work, and that money won't be around forever. So this is the time to really build some infrastructure and capacity. And I think building internal capacity within districts and buildings related to trauma and adversity is important. So, thinking about who are the champions, how can you develop some champions with more knowledge and expertise around trauma who can then share, that knowledge with others in the building and in the district. Other panelists have touched on, this needs to be done across all tiers of the MTSS, including in SEL. And I think one of the things that I would encourage schools to think about is how do you really talk about trauma in SEL programs? Because that's not really integrated so well in most programs. They do talk about feelings, they talk about thinking, they talk about difficult situations, but trauma is kind of a different animal. And I think if we continue to avoid that discussion, knowing that there are so many kids out there who are experiencing this and suffering from it. We sometimes inadvertently contribute to that avoidance of making it something that's okay to discuss. And then I would say a challenge is in tailoring services to students without knowing what they've experienced individually. You know, we can come up with SEL programs, but when you get into tier 2 and tier 3, and even knowing which students might need some tier 2 and tier 3, we need to understand what those kids have experienced and how it's affecting their well-being and their education. And that requires us to have some discussions about trauma and adversity that can be really difficult.
Absolutely. And you mentioned earlier the funding that's available. Particularly, I'm thinking of the ESSER funding and the opportunities that are there in terms of how those funds might be utilized for the purposes of supporting students with regard to their social emotional development and in this case trauma. Could you discuss some of the resources available to schools in support of students experiencing trauma, as well as staff facing primary or secondary trauma, which is also a very important issue, not often discussed?
Sure. Yeah. So the good news is that there are an increasing number of resources around trauma-informed care, trauma-informed work in general, and also trauma specific to schools. There are just some specific examples. We at CHDI have some reports, including a comprehensive report around trauma-informed school mental health that came out a couple years ago that's available on our website. The University of Maryland has a Center for School Mental Health. They put out a tremendous amount around trauma-informed school mental health, free resources. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network also has lots of free resources. And those are all things that can get either schools or individual staff some basic, information about what this looks like in schools and some strategies to start with. The other panelists touched on how important it is that this work is integrated with everything else, and I think that's also a common pitfall. Is we start to do all this trauma stuff, and it's just trauma here and trauma there, but it doesn't truly become integrated into the fabric of other things that we do, and I think that is really important to make it sustainable. And then I think you actually have to start with staff wellness. All the other panelists have also said this. I totally agree that essentially with trauma work, we are asking educators to think about and consider and talk about trauma with students and to support students. And we can't ask them to do that if they are traumatized themselves or don't feel supported themselves. It's to put on your own oxygen mask before you help somebody else. And so really have to start with the staff wellness. Staff have primary trauma, especially now during COVID, as well as secondary trauma from what their students have experienced and their students' families. One resource is the free training out of the University of Maryland called Support for Teachers Affected by Trauma, or SAT, the free online web training. And they also offer the SHAPE system, which is more of a step back look at your school's behavioral health supports and services and funding, and to identify needs and gaps. There's also a trauma component there. In the community, another resource that's available is trauma-focused services, mental health services. Connecticut is pretty rich in terms of resources for trauma treatments. And while most kids, who experience trauma may not need mental health treatment, those experts in the community are great resources when you think about school community provider connections. And many of them, may be available to come in and help develop a cohort of champions within your staff, or translate some of the information about trauma to your schoolwork. The last thing I'll say is that screening, screening for behavioral health concerns, screening for trauma is another thing that it seems like districts are beginning to think about. Some are beginning to do, and we have some resources on trauma screening on our website, and we're developing a interactive training for anybody that's interested in doing that. That should be out early next year as well.
Great, Jason, thank you. All really, really valuable resources. You mentioned the importance of school community connections, and we know one way we can facilitate that is through connections with families. So, Nitsa, we know that collaborative engagement with families is key. How might educators work collaboratively with families in identifying students who are at high risk for experiencing trauma and in the planning of effective interventions?
So I was thinking, I was driving once, right? Driving my older son to his high school. He's no longer there. And I came from Puerto Rico and I attended that same high school. So I got there and it was, I think for me, a traumatic experience. I don't know. I got there and I see a student at the door and I looked at him and I knew at that moment that he was lost. And I was brought back, that was a long time ago, to what I was wearing my first day of that high school. And I looked at my son because I was, my heart started beating fast. And I tell him, you see that child there? He's lost. No one's asking him, what is he doing? No, there's no mom, there's no dad next to him. That means they told him, like, nothing. And my son just looked at me and he was like, what? And at that moment, I say to myself, how do this could have been prevented if I only started with the family saying, I know it might be a little bit of work, but listening to that family and asking them about that child. Because Nitsa knows her child best. I'm not an expert. I might not be the expert in the intervention, but I know my child best. So if I know my child likes my son had an intervention with classical music when he was little to write for 10 minutes. That was a teacher asking me, and I felt part of. And she didn't ask me because, Nita's an educator too. She asked me because she said, you are the best person. So we have to really have that conversation. Ask the parent, take a little questionnaire, talk to them, call them and say, or tell me something amazing about your kid. Don't ask about school or anything, but just talk to get to know each other. We find that so hard, and that's going to take us a long way, because when parents called me about special education services, I can tell you that 95% of the time there's one response that I get when I ask the same question. And they ask about technical stuff, right? So the question I say, well, what is it that you want the team to know? And the answer is the same all the time, no matter what language, race, color. I just wanted them to listen to me the way you're doing right now. That's a big deal. Because if I'm planning an intervention, let's just think, and the child has a 504 plan for or SPED, and then maybe have experienced trauma, mother or dad or whoever is taking care of that child understands what's going on. Who am I to tell that parent, well, you don't know your kid like I know your kid? We have to get away from the fact that this is not an issue of understanding the intervention by itself. Is also the process of how do I get that child to work and have the intervention help him or her because of the experiencing trauma that they had. And that means putting away my judgment and putting anything away and being so intentional and start listening to the family and say, Nita can make decisions as well. So let me call her in. Let me just get to know her or him. So I think those things have to be in place before we think we can call them in for an intervention.
So that's really valuable information. And we recognize that one of the best ways in order to really connect with students and to connect with families so that we can best provide services to students, we really need to try to understand their cultural background and experiences. to the degree possible, certainly give it a shot, right? To try to understand who these students are and their families. So when we think in terms of interventions and supports, could you discuss some of the culturally relevant resources available in support of students and families experiencing trauma?
So at CERC, we are being very intentional with the equity piece. And one of the things we started doing was affinity groups, which means we are doing affinity groups by the race of the family. So we do things like that. So everybody gets invited. So there is an Asian one, there is an African American one, there's a Latino one. I have asked for a couple more, but we're waiting to see who can lead it, because if it's affinity, I cannot go and lead the Asian one. And we have also been very intentional to build the resources that are going to also help the parents. We have training going on called Raising Highly Capable Kids from the from the Search Institute, and it helps parents use those developmental assets to help their children in different ways. So we start from the premise that this is going to be a learning from all of us. We also do culturally responsive trauma informed strategies with schools in different ways. And we also have been we are going to run right now an early childhood education coaching session that is going to bring both the family and the teachers together, and they're both going to get the same content, because we want them to start, talking a little bit more with each other and know that they both want the same thing. So those are some examples of the things we have been doing.
Very exciting, very exciting. In closing, Eric, could you share some final thoughts on why understanding cultural views regarding mental health and response to trauma are important factors in engaging students of underrepresented groups?
Sure. I first just want to say thank you to the panelists and to you, Jocelyn. I feel like I've learned a tremendous amount already just from the discussion that we've had. And really, I think both Nitsa and Amber touched on biases and trust. And I think that's how I would kind of boil that down a little bit. Understanding the culture of the people that I work with is crucial. We carry our own culture with us. It influences everything we do, from the people we connect with to the ways in which we connect with one another. And regardless of how unbiased we try to be, we still have bias, right? And so I think it's incredibly important for us to understand what those biases are and how that impacts the relationships we have with those we work with. And part of that is if I want to build trust, as Nitsa said, if I want to connect with my students, I have to build trust. And I can't do that if I'm imposing my own views, my own values upon them. And I think that the value that we really need to connect with is valuing each other, right? So if I'm valuing my students, if I'm valuing their families, if I'm valuing the community that I work with, then I have a level of respect for them and their culture and what they bring into school. And I think it boils down to the culture and climate in our schools and how we have to foster that and make everyone feel welcome, regardless of who they are, what they look like. We're here to serve those students, and if I want to connect with them, I really need to put forth a little effort to understand their culture and their values. And then as a mental health practitioner as well, there are different levels of trust and value that students and clients and families will have toward the mental health process or mental health stigmas, and so understanding where they're coming from will help me connect with them. I may not be able to say, I may not be able to use counseling words or certain words with certain families because they just may be opposed to it. But if I talk in terms of providing help for their child and connect with them on that level, it likely will open doors and we can have a mutual conversation about what the child needs and how we can provide supportive help for them. So I guess I would boil it down to really me understanding my own biases and how I can understanding how I can connect with my students, and understanding their culture.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Nitsa, Amber, and Jason as well so much for sharing your thoughts and your expertise on this topic. This has been an amazing conversation. And I look forward to our continued interactions in support of Connecticut's youth and appreciate the attention you've given to this focus on trauma as a whole and more specifically its impact on underrepresented groups. And to those viewing this webinar, if you or others may be experiencing difficulties and could benefit from emotional support, assistance is available by calling 211 or utilizing the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration Confidential National Helpline, which is 1-800-662-HELP. Again, that's SAMHSA's helpline at 1-800-662-4357. Additionally, you may access a wealth of resources posted on CSDE's website under COVID-19 resources for families and educators. Just select Professional Support Webinar Series for districts, and you will find guidance on social and emotional learning. Again, thank you for your time and attention, and remember to take care of yourself and each other. Be well, everyone.